Today's date is May 12th, 2024. We are having a Israeli-Palestinian Confederation simulation with Professor Michael Steinberg of Brown University. We're also going to have an open discussion about whether Israel is a democracy. We are proposing peace. And the way we propose peace is by way of a common federal government for the people of Israel and Palestine based on democracy, secular principles, based on a constitution with a common parliament, which will be the legislative branch, a common executive branch, with president and vice president, and a common judicial branch, all with Palestinians and Israelis together as equal, with equal power. But we are not proposing the dismantlement of the Israeli or the Palestinian governments. We are proposing a federal government for the whole area of Israel, the West Bank and Gaza, 14 million people who will have a common federal government that will work together with the Israeli and the Palestinian governments, but it will be independent of the Israeli and the Palestinian governments. My name is Joseph Avasar. You can reach me at josephavassar@gmail.com. Our website is ipconfederation.org. If you go to that website, you can read the Constitution, which explains how this government will be created by way of elections, what will be the structure of the government, meaning the three branches, and what will be the relationship between the Israeli and the Palestinian governments and the common federal government. The purpose of creating a common federal government is to make peace for the people of Israel and Palestine. It's a very interesting read, and if you like the short version of it, then you have the frequently asked questions, and the Constitution is in English, Arabic, and Hebrew. We have a guest today, Michael Steinberg. Michael Steinberg is a professor of history and professor of music and German studies at Brown University. He served as president of the American Academy in Berlin and was a member of the Cornell University Department of History between 1988 and 2005. Professor Steinberg was educated at Princeton University and the University of Chicago, where he has been a visiting professor, as well as Michael, could you please help me pronounce the name of the universities in France and in Taiwan?
I'm sure I'll do better with the French one than the Chinese one, but École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris and National Tsinghua University in Taiwan.
Okay, thank you. His main research interests include a cultural history of modern Germany and Austria, with particular attention to German Jewish intellectual history and the cultural history of music. His recent books include The Trouble with Wagner and The Afterlife of Moses, Exile, Democracy, Renewal. I met with Professor Steinberg about a week ago, and I presented to him our formula, and we agreed on two pieces of legislation that we would be discussing today, in addition to the Constitution and the veto power that is given to the Israeli and the Palestinian governments. On May 26th, we will have Professor Avner Cohen, who is a non-proliferation and terrorism expert at Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, California. On June 9, we'll have Professor Ori Yehudai, who teaches history actually teaches Zionism and modern Israel, the Arab-Israeli conflict at the University at Ohio State University. On June 23rd, we will have Professor Barak Medina, who served as a dean of the law school. He was the dean of the law school in Jerusalem, Hebrew University. He is a graduate of the Hebrew University, where he got his PhD, and he also a graduate of Harvard Law School. On July 7th, we will have Amir Hetzroni. He is a professor of communication. He is anti-Zionist and speaks against the policies of Israel and Zionism on a regular basis in the Israeli media. These are previous participants that we had. Some of them participated more than once, and many of them support and endorse our formula for peace. This is the list of some people who did not accept our invitation or declined or ignored our invitation. The question is why? In my opinion, many people are just concerned about speaking about a formula for peace, and we would like to have them over regardless and ask them what is their concern about our formula for peace. The simulation today will take 120 minutes with the question and answer for Professor Steinberg. We are going to have a shorter simulation because we are adding an open discussion about whether Israel is a democracy. We have a short video that explains the IPC formula, and I would like to play that for you so that it makes it easier to understand.
The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians has endured for generations. And instead of time healing the wounds, it's only caused the anger to fester and the violence to grow. But what if there was a way to alleviate the tension? Something that may not outright solve every problem, but at least create a forum that encourages a peaceful compromise. Welcome to the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, a common third government between the Israeli and Palestinian citizens, specifically designed to foster peace, tolerance, and economic prosperity between the two nations. Here's how it works. First off, both Israel and Palestine will keep their respective governments. Israel's Knesset and the Palestinian National Authority will remain unchanged. The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, IPC, will be a third entity acting as a unifying agent between the two. The IPC will comprise 300 parliament members elected from 300 districts in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. Above them will preside a president and vice president, one Israeli and one Palestinian. In order for the IPC to pass a law, it will require a 55% majority from its Israeli representatives, as well as a 55% majority from its Palestinian representatives, thereby preventing either side from monopolizing the legislature. Of course, the IPC won't undermine the political power of either the Israeli or the Palestinian government. At any time, Israel or Palestine may veto a law passed by the IPC. If neither side vetoes, the law is passed. And the two nations are another step closer to resolution. Please help us make this a reality. The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation. We might speak different languages, but we all mean the same thing.
So we are going to be simulating what's on that video, and we will also have an open discussion regarding whether Israel is a democracy. That discussion will take place at the conclusion of the simulation. And like I said, the simulation will be a little shorter in order to have more time for the open discussion. At each simulation, we take a survey whether the audience support a common federal government for the people of Israel and Palestine. And we will compare that survey at the end of the simulation. We'll conduct another survey. Could you please, at this time, vote? Do you support a common federal government for the people of Israel and Palestine? Either yes or no. Okay, I'm going to allow 10 more seconds for people to vote. Okay, 5 seconds. All right, could you please publish the vote? 21 out of 26, 81% voted yes, and 5 out of 26, which is 19%, voted no. And we will conduct another survey at the end of the simulation. We are also adding another survey now, which is, do you believe Israel is a democracy? And we're asking you to vote before the simulation, and then we'll do, before the discussion, and then we'll do another one after the discussion. So could you please vote now on the question of Israel? Do you believe it's a democracy? Either yes or no. I know that some of you are not able to vote. By the way, I am not able to vote either, and neither is Dan, the co-host. Okay, I'm going to allow 10 more seconds. All right, can you publish the vote? 8 out of 25 voted, which is 32%, voted yes. And 17 out of 25 voted no, and that's 68%. And we'll do the same vote at the end of the discussion. The objective of the simulation is to demonstrate how a common federal government for the people of Israel would make peace. We are not a representative of the Israeli or the Palestinian narrative or their government. Michael Steinberg is not a representative of the IPC. He was invited to conduct a stress test to tell us what's wrong or what's right about our formula for peace. We are pro-peace. We do not follow the Israeli narrative or the Palestinian narrative. And we do not think that when the common federal government will be created, we don't think that it would follow the Israeli or the Palestinian narrative, because it is a common federal government for the whole area of Israel and Palestine. We do not preclude other formulas for peace, and we are not claiming exclusivity. In fact, we invite other organizations, if they want to do a simulations or to explain their formula, we invite them as well. We will ask you, the audience, and Professor Steinberg, to judge our plan not based on perfection, but based on the alternative. No plan can be perfect. Perfection is the enemy of good. But what's the alternative? That's the question that we will ask you and Professor Steinberg to judge on that standard. We are of the belief that a common federal government could pass legislation that neither the Israeli nor the Palestinian government will be able to veto. That's the gist of what we are proposing. We are saying that it would cost them legitimacy within the international community and their own community, their own national community, if they veto legislation that is reasonable and beneficial to the people of Israel and Palestine. We can show many legislation that the Israeli and the Palestinian government will not be able to veto because of political reasons. But we cannot show you all the legislation because of time constraints. We're asking you to look at the big pictures and to avoid technical arguments. We are limited by time, so technical questions are not really the time to ask at this time, because we just want to show you the big picture. We're asking you to refrain from comments, but we encourage you to ask questions. Some people ask us, what is the difference between a confederation or a federation? Do you follow that definition of a confederation or a federation? It doesn't matter to us. We are here to create a definition, not to follow a definition. Confederation government exists worldwide to address specific conflicts. Some governments refer to themselves as federal governments, while others use the term confederation. Definitions are not fixed and evolve with changing realities. In the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the IPC defines confederation as a shared government for the people of Israel and Palestine, guided by democratic principles outlined in the IPC Constitution, which can be found at ipconfederation.org. That's the constitution that I showed you at the beginning of this simulation. We are mimicking a model. This is not a speech. This is a simulation, and we're asking you to respect that. That means that we are encouraging questions. So if you look at the plane and you say, at the picture, and you say, Joseph, how does this thing fly? That's a question. We encourage questions. But comments are not encouraged during the simulation. You can put your comments in the chat or wait until the end. Comments derail the simulation and prevent us for full presentation of the federal government that we are proposing. We're asking you for your courtesy in allowing us a full opportunity to present the IPC formula. Make your comments at the end or write them on the Zoom chat feature. This is the heart of the simulation. And we're asking you to make assumptions. The first assumptions that we're asking you to make is that we were able to obtain major funding for a year campaign to advertise the upcoming elections, that the elections will take place 3 months, to advertise the benefit of a common federal government, and to tell the people of Israel and Palestine, and really the people of the whole world, about the benefits of a federal government. That the funding will allow us to recruit parliament members and candidates for president and vice president, and to explain to the public what this election is about. Frankly, the campaign will also be needed in order to refute issues that are going to be raised by the governments themselves, by individuals who have interest against the federal government. So I want you to assume that we were able to obtain sufficient funding to do all of that. I also want you to assume that the funding allowed the 14 million people, excluding children, in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza to vote. And like I said, the election will take place online for a period of 3 months. I also want you to assume that 5 million people voted, 3 million Palestinian voted, and 2 million Israeli voted in the area of Gaza, the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Israel. I also want you to assume that the president received 1.5 million votes. That's an Israeli person. For the purpose of this simulation, I want you to assume that me, Joseph, was elected president. I do not ever intend to run as president. I'm not even qualified under the Constitution, but it makes it easier for me to play that role in the simulation. And a Palestinian lady received 1.3 million votes, and we will rotate in 2 years. I also want you to assume that 300 parliament members were elected in 300 districts, just like it showed in the video. And each parliament members represent a district of 47,000 people. So we have 300 parliament members representing the whole area of Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. We will ask you to act as parliament members. I will need some volunteers to be the Israeli prime minister and the Palestinian president. And this is the map of the area upon which you will represent as parliament members. So you'll have to look and decide what area you are representing in this simulation. So before I turn to Professor Steinberg to give us his comments or questions regarding these assumptions, I want to go to the audience. Do you have any questions regarding these assumptions? The audience. You can either speak them out or put that in the chat, and Jeff will monitor that part of questions. But do you have any questions regarding these assumptions? Please raise your hand or just speak up. Okay, I don't know if you are shy or understand it, but I assume that you do. So let me go to, no, I'm assuming that you understand it, that you're not shy. And
somebody has a question.
I'm sorry?
Michael Lindsay raised his hand, but
Okay.
he's muted.
My question is very simple. The vote, is it first past the post or some form of proportional representation?
You're asking how the districts are being created?
How the representatives are elected? Is it pure majority or is it transferable vote?
No, each district will elect one person. The districts are created by computer formula, basically just algorithm, computer algorithm. Each district will have 47,000 people. There is a certain threshold of votes that needs to be reached, and I believe that's about 3% of the eligible voters in that district. And whoever gets the most number of votes in that district, whether he is Israeli or Palestinian, will be representing that district. Any other questions? Okay. Michael, do you have any comments or questions regarding these assumptions?
No, everything that's fine for now. There may be changes later, but that's another matter.
Okay. I'm asking Professor Steinberg, do you have any comments or questions regarding these assumptions?
Well, I think the initiative is very exciting, and I certainly support the idea, and I think the formulas are extremely well worked out. I think that, well, a couple of comments. I think that clearly the challenge is infinitely greater now than it was before October 7th. So the uphill struggle is, I think, a very steep one. And it seems to me that any hope of a realization depends on both increased expectations and diminished expectations, increased expectations in the form of the basic collaboration and will to establish something like this, and the decreased the question of what kind of working relationship is necessary. So one idea I'd like to pursue a bit, maybe later on if there's time, is a notion advanced by an Israeli philosopher, Avishai Margalit, who has written about the idea of thin relations as opposed to thick relations, being the kind of working relationship with limited emotional investment that can form this kind of political community. I think that's a very helpful thought, and maybe we'll have time to talk about it a bit more later.
Okay. Are there any particular parts of the assumptions that you think are not achievable if we are able to secure major funding?
I think they're achievable. My question is, how much time will it take to achieve them? So the assumptions involve the claim that all of this is already in place. So one thing to ask is, how long would it take beyond the funding period to have a very elaborate structure like this in place? If you think, for example, of the European Union, which is obviously very embattled, but still a major success in terms of an unexpectedly successful confederation, that was a very incremental process, right? Beginning with an economic zone and then gradually adding to its political structure and its political authority. So that would be my major question. If this were to be put in place over a period of 10, 20, 30 years, what would be the process? How would this full repertoire of assumptions be achieved over a period of time?
We actually think that it could be implemented within 1 year. We don't see the difficulty in doing it. This is done completely outside the Israeli and the Palestinian governments, and most of it is technical, and because it's technical and it is a separate and independent methodology, it's going to be a lot easier to conduct because it is outside the Israeli and the Palestinian governments, and it's basically technical. All right, let me go to the audience. And now I'm going to ask you, the audience, first of all, I need volunteers for the purpose of conducting this simulation. We need a volunteer to act as Palestinian president. Do I have a volunteer to act as Palestinian president in this simulation? Please raise your hand. Michael Lindsay, are you willing to be the Palestinian president in this simulation? Okay, good. You need to unmute. I need a Prime Minister of Israel. Do I have a volunteer to act as Prime Minister of Israel? Please raise your hand.
Well, if nobody wants to be the nasty guy, I can be it.
Okay. Okay, but you have to assume his personality, Giacomo.
I'll be nasty, don't worry.
Okay. All right.
Giacomo, you have a lot of static when you open your mic. Maybe.
Okay. Now the rest of you will have to choose whether you are Israeli or Palestinian parliament members. This is a map of the area. You will have to be intellectually honest and decide what area do you represent. Is your area exclusively Israeli? Is your area exclusively Palestinian? Or is your area a mixed district? And you'll have to stay in that mode throughout this simulation. So I'm going to ask first for Palestinian parliament members to identify yourself. Palestinian parliament members, please. And also for that matter, I didn't realize we can do both Palestinian and Israeli. So let's have Israeli parliament members also. So if you choose to be a Palestinian parliament members, check the Palestinian box. If you choose to be Israeli, check the Israeli box. That's for the purpose of the simulation. Okay, I'm gonna allow 20 more seconds for everyone to decide what they want to be in this simulation. Okay, 15 more seconds. 10. Okay, 5 more seconds. Please publish the votes. We have 14 Palestinians and 9 Israeli. And you may be asked what area you represent, and you'll have to remain in that capacity. We're going to now ratify the Constitution. Before we ratify the Constitution, you must understand that since now you are a parliament member, you have to accept the Constitution because you have been elected as either Israeli or Palestinian parliament members, and you stated in advance that you accept the Constitution. So if you vote against ratifying the Constitution, you will be expelled, and the person who received the second number of votes from your district will become parliament members. The Prime Minister of Israel and the Palestinian leader are not allowed to vote. You are in a separate government. You are not asked to ratify the Constitution. All right. And you cannot vote on any legislation. The only thing you have is a veto power. Charles, are you available? Let me read the Constitution. This is a short version of the Constitution. We believe that Palestinians and Israelis are entitled to equal rights under the law and guaranteed human rights and freedom. The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation does not intend to supersede or supplant the Palestinian or Israeli government, nor to abrogate or undermine any agreements between those governments. We recognize the need to work with the Israeli and Palestinian governments. Our purpose is to resolve conflicts and to expand the relationship between Palestinians and Israelis in a fair and equitable manner. We believe in equal rights under the law, guaranteed human rights, and freedom for all. We voluntarily give the legislator and the governments of Israel and Palestine veto power over legislation we pass relating to the domain of control of those governments. We believe in the separation of power between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. We believe in the creation of a permanent secular government for all the people residing in Israel and Palestine. We believe in having a separate judicial branch relating to IPC legislation with Israeli and Palestinian judges with a system to avoid biased decision based on nationality. So this is a short version of the Constitution. It's really an explanation of the Constitution. The main important part is that we do not intend to undermine or supersede any agreements between the Israeli or the Palestinian governments, and we do not intend to undermine those governments. So whatever agreements the Israeli and the Palestinian governments enter into and agreed upon, we are prohibited from undermining those agreements. We have to accept any agreement made by the Israeli and the Palestinian governments. So if they choose to agree on 2 states or 1 state, if they agree on borders or whatever else they agree upon, we are constitutionally required to accept that agreement. We also give the Israeli and the Palestinian governments veto power upon issues that violates their sovereignty. So if we pass legislation that violates the sovereignty of either the Israeli or the Palestinian governments, we give them a veto power over that legislation, so that any legislation that violates their sovereignty will be accepted by the Israeli or the Palestinian government because they have a veto power. Before I go to Professor Steinberg, does anyone have questions regarding this constitution?
I have a little question. What do we mean by undermining? And what if the government of Israel decide to enter Gaza and exterminate everybody there? Should we respect it? Should we, I mean, in this situation, if we say no way, we're undermining them, right? So where are we on that? It's not that simple.
We give them a veto power on every issue that violates their sovereignty. So if it violates their sovereignty, they have a veto power. We cannot pass legislation that violates their sovereignty. Any other questions? Okay, here, I see no hands raised.
Friendly question, please.
Yes.
Okay, you talk about the Palestinians will have sovereignty over the West Bank, say, as well as Gaza, but I represent the West Bank. Does that mean that these settlements, Israeli settlements, would be removed so that we would have total sovereignty?
Any substantive issue, whether it is settlements, whether it is Jerusalem, whether it is the right of return for Palestinian refugees, all these issues will be decided by the federal government based on 55% of the Israeli government, parliament members and 55% of the Palestinian parliament members, and it will be given to the Israeli and the Palestinian governments for veto. We are not, this is a constitution, basically the framework of the relationship. We are not dealing with substantive issues at this time because it would be up to the parliament to decide how to proceed on specific issues. Any other questions? Okay, I see no hands. So let me go to Professor Steinberg. Professor Steinberg, do you have any questions or comments regarding this? Well, before we do that, before I go to Professor Steinberg, let's take a vote. Palestinian and Israeli, Palestinian parliament members, please vote on this. Do you ratify the Constitution? This is only Palestinian parliament members. Do you ratify the Constitution? Palestinian parliament members. Okay, let's publish the vote. 100% of the Palestinian parliament members accepted the Constitution and ratified it. Let's go to the Israeli parliament members. Do you support the Constitution? You ratify the Constitution, Israeli parliament members. Okay, publish the vote. 100% of the Israeli parliament members, so congratulations. This is the first time in history that the area of Israel, Palestine was able to come up with a constitution based on secular democratic principles that is accepted to the people of Israel and Palestine. This is a momentous event in the history of humanity, not only the history of this moment, but the history of humanity. We are able to change history by accepting this constitution, and this will be reverberating throughout the world, and me as the president, I am going to use the capital that was given to us by this Constitution in order to pursue the world, the governments, the Israeli and the Palestinian governments, to make sure that they do not veto legislation and that they support us politically and intellectually and monetarily. All right, let's go to Professor Steinberg. Do you have any comments or questions after you've seen this momentous event in history?
Let me make the comment or ask the question in a provocative way. And that's assuming that this has been done, what prevents the larger citizenships, the larger publics all around the area of thinking of us as 300 crazy people who got together in some basement and passed this despite all of the realities of the area? So the more polite way to ask the question is, how do we create or assume the kind of goodwill and informal legitimacy? I understand there's a formula here for formal or political legitimacy, but how do we create or assume that there is a kind of popular support, a kind of informal support for this kind of thing that would give any credibility at all to it in the context of other political structures and in the context of the historical moment?
Well, the legitimacy comes from the votes. We have 5 million people voted. More than I was elected by 1.5 million votes, more than any prime minister of Israel or even creating a coalition. We are not just a bunch of crazy people in the basement. We were actually able to obtain the funding. We were able to obtain the 300 parliament members to run. In fact, more than 300. 300 were elected. We were able to get 5 million people to vote, and we were able to ratify a constitution. So the idea of portraying us as a bunch of crazy people is totally out of the reality of what we see here, that we have changed the reality. We have people voting. We have people elected. You can ask the same question about any democracy in the world. Why are we at a different level of rationality?
And the 5 million people voting, do they have the same degree of information that we have here? In other words, is the Constitution part of what they're voting for?
Yes, that's why we need a 1-year campaign to have a discussion about the Constitution, about the fact that it is fair to both sides, and it is the only way to go forward. But let me ask you, you answer a question with a question. Do you think that most people in democracies around the world have knowledge and information about the Constitution of their country?
Probably not, but they're supposed to.
I know. So why are the people of Israel and Palestine need to demonstrate a higher knowledge of the Constitution than any other country in the world in order to be accepted as a legitimate government? Why is the higher standard?
I don't think it's a higher standard, but I think that we're in a situation, and have been for a long time, of a kind of emergency, so that this is coming at a moment of crisis. And even if it weren't a moment of crisis, it would be a very new situation. So if you put those two things together, I think it'll be a fairly sensitive and conflicted agenda. Whereas in other places, there's an assumption that constitutions have been around forever. And therefore, there's a status quo that doesn't really need to be known in detail or messed around with.
All right. Okay, so now that we passed the Constitution, and we are the parliament, and we have legitimacy from we are the only legitimate government in Israel, Palestine, by the way. The Israeli government is not a legitimate government in Israel, Palestine, because it's not elected by the people of Israel and Palestine, even though it controls the area. The Palestinian governments are not legitimate government. They haven't had an election, and they are certainly not legitimate in Israel, Palestine. So we are the only government that provided the entire population an opportunity to vote. And we are the only government that has parliament members representing specific districts who are elected by specific voters in that district. Let's go to our first order of business, and that's granting a veto power to the separate governments. I saw Charles join us. Charles, are you able to read this legislation for us?
The Confederation is the government of the entire population of Israel and Palestine, from the river to the sea. We recognize the Palestinian and Israeli governments and are seeking their cooperation to implement our vision for peace by giving them a veto. We will do our utmost to satisfy the essential needs of each government. We are pleading with the Palestinian and Israeli public to understand that while we would like to pass the best legislation possible to improve their lives, under these constraints, a perfect legislation is not possible. We hereby bestow a veto power relating to legislation affecting sovereignty to the following: the government of Israel on issues in which it is indispensable, the Palestinian government on issues in which it is indispensable. In the event of changes in the entirety of the Israeli or Palestinian governments, this legislation may be amended or repealed, subject to the IPC Constitution. The Parliament will decide on indispensability. Vetoes may be bestowed individually or collectively.
All right, so we have two slides that explain this granting of veto power. The first question that always comes up is, what's the difference between dispensable government and indispensable government? A government is indispensable if its cooperation is necessary to implement the IPC legislation. So if we need the cooperation of the Israeli or the Palestinian government, they become indispensable. So if we pass legislation regarding the use of land, regarding common police force, removal of the wall, the Israeli and the Palestinian governments become indispensable. However, if we pass legislation regarding our budgets or ratifying the Constitution or appointing IPC ministers, they are dispensable and they do not get a veto power. Why is it necessary to give a veto power? Because it provides a safety net to both sides, the Israeli and the Palestinian governments and the Palestinian governments and the public. It increases the likelihood of Israeli and Palestinian participation because they understand that we are not trying to undermine the Israeli or the Palestinian governments. We are for peace, and we recognize the sovereignty of the Israeli and the Palestinian government. It decreases the chance that the Israeli and the Palestinian governments have any reason to oppose a federal government, and removes any claims that the IPC is a subversive, has any subversive intentions. The veto power assures the Israeli and the Palestinian governments that we are not trying to undermine those governments. And it gives protection, legal protection to candidates to run, and without the fear that they will be subject to criminal prosecution by either the Israeli or the Palestinian governments, because we are not trying to subvert those governments. And it completes the IPC, it compels the IPC to treat, or to thread the needle to find the least objectionable legislation. So by having the veto power, both the Israeli and the Palestinian parliament will have to pass legislation that is narrowly defined, that makes the Israeli and the Palestinian governments unlikely to pass, to veto it. and it creates a platform. The veto power creates a platform for negotiations with a deadline. The negotiations is between the Israeli, the Palestinian, and the federal government regarding legislation. So we are not proposing that we will just show up one day and write legislation and force the Israeli and the Palestinian government to accept it. We are speaking about a process of negotiations, a process that would include the political power of the federal government to pass, at the end of the day, legislation that will force the Israeli and the Palestinian governments to accept it. So does anyone have any questions regarding this veto power? Before I go to Professor Steinberg, do you have any questions regarding this veto power? Please raise your hands or put it in the chat. And Jeff, if you see any questions in the chat, let me know.
Okay.
Does anyone have any questions? Please raise your hands. See no questions. So let me go to Professor Steinberg. Professor Steinberg, do you have any questions or comments regarding this legislation?
A hypothetical question, which is what would happen in the case of a government on either side, meaning the individual government, that would be so hostile to this initiative as to declare a blanket veto of every legislation that it proposes?
That's the job of the president and the parliament members to make sure that those governments will lose legitimacy internationally and within their own people if the legislation is reasonable. So what we are really acquiring is huge political power. The federal government will have huge political power and can use that political power to persuade the Israeli and the Palestinian government, and for that matter, the world governments, to support legislation that is beneficial to the Israeli and the Palestinian people. You know, there are many governments in the world that have veto power, and the President of the United States also has a veto over legislation. The veto power is a mechanism. Any other comments or questions, Professor Steinberg?
No, that's fine for now. Thank you.
Okay, so let's have the Palestinian parliament members please vote on, do you support the declaration to intend to grant the veto power? Palestinian parliament members. We need 55% of the Palestinian parliament members to agree to this legislation. Okay, please publish the vote. 90% of the Palestinian parliament members supported this legislation. And let's go to the Israeli parliament members. Israeli parliament members, please vote. We need 55%. If we have 55% of both, this legislation passes and it is not subject to a veto power. In other words, the legislation about a veto power is not subject to a veto power by the Israeli or the Palestinian governments because they are dispensable on this issue. All right, publish the vote. 100% of the Israeli parliament members voted to give a veto power. So we now have a basis upon which to work regarding future legislation, and the Israeli and the Palestinian governments do not have a veto power over this. So this is the first legislation that Professor Steinberg wanted to discuss, rebuilding Gaza and Southern Israel. Charles, could you please read this out? Charles. Okay, I'll read it. I need to minimize the window here because I don't see the whole thing. Okay. The IPC is the only legitimate government in Israel and Palestine, consisting of 300 parliament members elected by the entire population. Approximately 125 members represent the destroyed areas. The IPC is committed to the well-being of all people, including the 5 million individuals directly affected by the violence since October 7th. The IPC believes that the future of the Gaza and Israeli people is interconnected. It is unlikely that the Israeli and the Palestinian governments will be able to restore a normal, peaceful existence in the foreseeable future. The IPC is requesting a $50 billion grant from the international community, which includes Israel and Palestine, to fund and coordinate the rebuilding of the devastated areas. The IPC will prioritize the following. Number one, rebuilding thousands of homes, roads, hospitals, civic buildings, and infrastructure to facilitate the immediate return of all people to their homes. Number two, restoring the law and order and civil society that have been destroyed. Number three, developing safe routes for peaceful movement of Palestinians between the West Bank and Gaza in both directions. To achieve this rebuilding, the IPC is calling for an immediate ceasefire and immediate return of all political prisoners in Israel and Palestine to their homes. Both the Israeli and the Palestinian governments are given veto power because they are indispensable on this legislation. Does anyone have any questions regarding this legislation? Questions? Do you have any questions regarding this legislation? Please raise your hand. Okay, I see no questions. Let me go to Professor Steinberg. Well, before I go to Professor Steinberg, let's take a vote. Palestinian parliament members, please vote. Do you support this legislation? Palestinian parliament members only. We need 55% of the Palestinian parliament members from the entire area of Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza to vote on this legislation. And let's publish the vote. We have 100% of the Palestinian parliament members agreeing to this legislation. Let's have the Israeli parliament members. Israeli parliament members, do you support this legislation? Israeli parliament members? I don't see the votes for some reason. Okay, we'll give it 5. Okay, here we are. Okay, publish the votes. 100% of the, can you please publish, okay. 100% of the Israeli parliament members voted in this legislation. Before I go to Professor Steinberg, I want to play the whole scenario. Let's go to the Palestinian president. Mr. President of the Palestinian Authority, are you going to veto this legislation? Mr. President of Palestine, are you going to veto this legislation?
No, I will not veto it.
Okay, let's go to the Prime Minister of Israel. Mr. Prime Minister, are you going to veto this legislation?
Yes, I'm vetoing it. I would have a technical note to make, which is that in your resolution, you call for a 50 billion grant from the international community, and you also call for an immediate ceasefire. These are two issues that should not be subject to veto because you can adopt them yourselves without us interfering. But I will veto the rest because until I have destroyed every single Hamas cell, I will not stop fighting. But I will accept, if you do manage to raise money, I will accept your contribution if you present a sensible project to participate in the future of Gaza. according to, however, to our terms. But I am vetoing this current text.
Okay.
I'm open to negotiating.
Are you vetoing it because of the ceasefire language?
I am vetoing it because it gives too much control to you. We want to be in full control of the future of Gaza. And because, of course, you make this unrealistic call for a ceasefire right now, we are prioritizing the destruction of Hamas.
Okay, so I would like to have a private conversation with you before I go public. And I would tell you, Mr. Prime Minister, you have devastated that area. You have no way to bring the area back into normal existence. If you veto this legislation, I will expose you. I will talk to the international community and to the people of Israel and work privately and publicly to undermine your government. You are sitting on a very, very narrow coalition. And I will demonstrate to the people of Israel and Palestine that there is a way to solve this issue and to bring the people in the Israeli people back to Southern Israel and to bring the people in Israel back to Northern Israel, because this will bring peace to the people of Israel and Palestine. And I will show the people of Israel and Palestine and the whole world that you are standing in the way. So I'm going to use my entire capital power to pressure you. And this is a private conversation, you understand? I'm not going yet public.
Absolutely. Well, you have to understand, because it's a private conversation, that I have a political career to take care of. And so I am not going to budge from certain principles because I want to survive politically.
Okay. All right. Okay. So look, the purpose is not to convince you. The purpose is to demonstrate to the audience here how this common federal government will use its political power in order to pressure the Israeli and the Palestinian government and the whole world to benefit the people of Israel and Palestine. Let me go to Professor Steinberg. You've seen a display of how this thing will work. Do you have any comments or questions regarding this legislation?
Well, clearly we're prisoners of timing here. And so whether this is being considered during wartime or after the war is over, it's going to make a huge difference. So I think that has something to do with the motivation to veto or not. I also think, and this is part of the general kind of PR and education campaign that I mentioned earlier, that the subtleties of political allegiances need to be communicated very clearly. For example, within the Palestinian members of this body or the voters in general, what kind of allegiance to, for lack of a better example, Fatah and Hamas are in place. I'm thinking of that today because there is an initiative that has been announced, so far as I know, just in the last couple of days by Birzeit University in Ramallah to collect funds worldwide to rebuild education, especially higher education in Gaza. You can find all this online very easily. So this is being thought of very intensely, obviously not only in the educational sector, but since that's where I come from, that's how I'm best informed.
I want to clarify your comments to see if I understand it correctly. Are you concerned that the parliament members will have allegiance to either the Israeli government or the Palestinian organizations or their governments, that they will have double or dual loyalty?
No, not dual loyalty, but that they're within each side, within the Israeli membership and the Palestinian membership, there will be differences of opinion and different loyalties. So the two main categories in terms of Palestinian political organization are likely to remain Hamas and Fatah.
Yeah, but I don't think I made it clear at the beginning that the parliament members, in order to be a parliament member, you have to swear allegiance to the federal government, and you have to renounce any affiliation or allegiance to any other organization or government in order to be part of the Israeli-Palestinian Parliament Confederation. All right. Okay, let's go to the...
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Okay. One thing that I would be concerned about presenting this legislation is that we're turning to these grants from other countries. And I would say that other countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, that have already invested billions of dollars into Gaza to help build cities and buildings, want some kind of assurances that what's going to stop this from us having to do this again and again, because we feel like these countries feel like they've been sending monies left and right, but there's no sort of guarantees that Israel's not going to do this again. I feel like this is a bailout plan for Israel's wars.
So what's your question?
So my question would be, do you think, Professor Steinberg, do you think that this is something that's going to be brought up now if we present legislation like this and then go to countries that have already, over the last 2 decades, have invested billions of dollars and seen that loss through these wars?
Well, we may go again and ask for billions of dollars. There's nothing that precludes.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that there should be something added. I think that I'm asking Professor Steinberg, do you think that these countries now are kind of like more hesitant to participate in any kind of rebuilding because they feel that it's a redundant thing that's been happening every 4 or 5 years?
Well, I think that they need to be persuaded that this is the only hope for the future, is a kind of rebuilding. And they would need to be reminded of the enormous efforts that have been made, both in the public sector and the private sector, for these kinds of collaborative institutions. So collaboration across boundaries at the institutional level. Again, I think of the universities, which is the area that I know best, but there are also, for example, arts initiatives, cultural initiatives that have been very successful, even if on a kind of micro level compared to the whole population, and certainly in a time of conflict. So I don't think that the long-term investments in all of these initiatives are either lost or have lost credibility, but I do think that it'll take enormous work, as you say, to restore people's confidence that they can be effective.
I want to add that your question does not take into consideration that we have a completely different political reality here. Your question relates to the scenario of Israel versus Palestine. We have a common federal government, and your question totally ignores that. So we never before went to any country, and the constellation of a federal government has never been shown or ever been utilized in the past to any country. And to tie us to the sins of the Israeli and the Palestinian governments is totally unfair to us. We are a federal government, a democracy for the people of Israel and Palestine, and we do not want to be tied to the history that the Israeli and the Palestinian governments have created in their hostility and their failure to give peace to their people. It's not fair to us. All right, let's go to our next.
May I interject a comment here?
Sure, go ahead.
We're generous to say that it's a privilege of mine. So yeah, just to put on my historian's hat for a second, I think what you say is very important. However, the history of confederation speaks against that kind of confidence. So that the history of confederation models, certainly starting in the early 19th century, have a kind of conflict between the formal model, which is similar to what we have here, and then the general suspicion that that model is too shallow, and the suspicion that ghosts from the past or power structures from the past will come back and really call the shots. So this was the case all through 19th century Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. It was again the case after the fall of empires, after World War I, and we're seeing it to an extent now in some of the oppositions to the European Union and the rise of nationalist populism in Europe. So I think that's worth keeping in mind, and it's the reason that I've been kind of stubborn in insisting that a very hardworking, ongoing legitimation campaign and outreach is going to have to accompany any kind of establishment of structure.
I have a feeling that you're speaking about confederations that were created by existing governments as either some sort of a common government, but the existing governments continue to control the confederation. And perhaps that's the reason why they failed. But I don't think there is a historical precedent for the creation of a common federal government by the people of Israel, by the people themselves, independent of the existing governments. So the examples that you use, I don't think are relevant to what the formula that we are proposing.
Well, I would debate you on that, but maybe that's another private conversation, Mr. President.
Okay, but can you name me one federal government that was created independently of the people, of the governments, by the people?
Well, by the people is a problem because of the limits of democracy, but none of the ones I'm thinking of were created by pre-existing governments. So that's the case after the fall of the French Empire, the Napoleonic Empire, after the fall of the various empires in 1918, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the German. And it's true to an extent with the European Union, which has a lot of new individual governments as well as the surviving ones.
I don't think the internet existed in those years, and I don't think there was ever an election by the people themselves, ignoring their failed government. All right, let's go to the next legislation because we need to move on. Joint economic zone. So this is the next legislation, creating a joint economic zone between Israel and Gaza with exclusive Israeli-Palestinian Confederation management and control in cooperation with the existing governments, common economy, education, industry, banking, agriculture, sewer treatment, desalination plants, solar farms, wind powers, and green energy, international airport and seaport, equally accessible to the Israeli and the Palestinians. So we are proposing a joint economic zone that would include all these features in the area of Israel and Gaza, sharing the land in Israel and Gaza to create all these features to promote the economy and employment on both sides. And this legislation is being given to the Israeli and the Palestinian government for veto. Does anyone have any questions regarding these legislation? This specific legislation? Do you have any questions? Please raise your hand. Okay, I see no questions. Let's have the Palestinian parliament members. Palestinian parliament members, please vote on this joint economic zone. Okay, publish the vote. All of the Palestinian parliament members voted in favor of this legislation. Let's have the Israeli parliament members please vote. We need 55% for this legislation to pass in order to submit it to the Israeli and Palestinian governments and give them a veto power. 55% is what we need. Can you publish the vote? 78% of the Israeli parliament members voted in favor of this legislation. So congratulations. Let's go to the Palestinian president, Mr. President of Palestine. Are you going to veto this legislation?
No, sir.
Okay, let's go to the Israeli Prime Minister. Mr. Prime Minister, are you going to veto this legislation?
Yes, I'm going to veto the legislation. The the funding, all this idea is great, but we will not ever relinquish control of the management of anything to you. However, if you agree to modify your decision to allow us to have a complete control of whoever is managing these projects, and we can reject and veto people that we don't like. And if we can do this, we are willing to give limited support to start some initial projects and see how confidence building gestures to see how it would work.
Okay. So your objection is to the exclusive IPC management and control?
Yes, we do not want to relinquish control of the management of such an idea.
So if we change that to IPC, Israeli and Palestinian control with the IPC, would that be acceptable to you?
Yes, if that means that we have veto power on who are the managers that we don't like, we can be able to no.
All right. Okay. So I think you've seen a display how this formula will work and how we will be negotiating with the Israeli and the Palestinian governments. So let's go to Professor Steinberg. Professor Steinberg, do you have any comments? I see you raise your hand. You don't need to raise your hand. Okay. What are your comments?
My question actually goes to the Prime Minister of Israel in reference to the veto, and that is, what is your understanding of the status of the borders in relation to the joint economic zone? Are we assuming open borders? Are we assuming, for example, open access to the airport, to the ports? I understand the management question. What about questions of access?
Are you asking me?
No, well, I was first asking.
You're asking the Prime Minister of Israel.
Prime Minister.
Giacomo's muted. There he goes.
Yeah, my view is that this issue, the way I see it, has to be a very, very gradual thing. I do not trust the Palestinians. Therefore, I am not going to relinquish any control of anything here. If we can establish a joint economic zone, it would have to be in a very gradual way, and to be able to build enough confidence on our side that the Palestinians are able to make a significant contribution and that they will not be using these things in a way that will be detrimental to my country. And so on a very tentative scale, I would accept some very gradual steps towards building some joint economic zone. But this will be a goal in the future. For the moment, I would just see it as an incremental movement towards that.
All right.
Confidence building is the word I would use.
Professor Steinberg, do you have any comments regarding this legislation and how the process that has been displayed in front of you works with regard to this legislation?
Well, I guess to restate the question, it would have to do with the status of borders. Are borders open, and does the economic zone presuppose or depend on open borders? In other words, freedom of access, especially commercial access to airports, travel, etc.
Okay. All right, let's go to the post-simulation survey, and then we'll go to the open discussion. After participating in the simulation, do you support a common federal government for the people of Israel, the West Bank? Now, everyone vote on that. Please vote. I'll compare that with the previous votes that we had. Before we had 81% voting yes. I'm gonna allow 10 more seconds for people to vote. We need to reach at least the number of votes we had before. So we have a little less. Okay, please vote. Yeah, we need more votes. I'm going to allow 10 more seconds. Share Okay. So 100%, it went up from 81% to 100%, but the number of votes went down from 26 to 23. Oh, it was 21 out of 26. Now it's 23 out of 23, but 100% voted yes. Okay. So we have no votes at this time, which is good as far as I'm concerned. Let's go to the next issue, and that's the open discussion. Is Israel a democracy? And we will have a survey to follow after this discussion of whether Israel is a democracy. So I'm going to stop sharing, and we'll have an open discussion with Professor Steinberg on the question of Israel, the democracy. I'm just going to say a few words on that. I don't see Israel as a democracy. The reason is democracy allows everyone to vote. In a democracy, the people decide who the government is, and it's not the government that decides who the people are. And when you have people in the West Bank, in Gaza and East Jerusalem that are not allowed to vote, and because they haven't been given citizenship, but they have to follow Israeli law and they have to follow Israeli Supreme Court decisions, then it's not a democracy because they cannot vote for a government. But Professor Steinberg, do you want to say something about that? And then the audience will be given an opportunity to speak about whether Israel is a democracy.
Well, I agree with your assessment. I think that there are some arguments against it, but I am in agreement. I think one argument against it is that Israeli politics is run by institutions that we associate with democracy, meaning political parties, a parliamentary system, etc. But if we take, there are two problems there. One is clearly the question of occupation, where the people living in occupation do not have rights of citizenship. So that's the overwhelming problem. Second problem is the conflict between democracy and the idea of the nation and the national state law that was passed in 2018, so that the nation is a cultural entity and a democracy is a principle of representation among all the people. There's a terrible ambiguity in the history of democracy about that, which I won't get into now. It has to do with what actually the people, quote unquote, is. In other words, is the people a unified entity, or is it a large collection of individuals? That's a definition problem that has never been resolved. So the problem goes way back, but I think it's particularly extreme in the Israeli case.
Okay. Shlomo, do you want to contribute to that discussion? Is Israel a democracy?
Yeah, I would like to, but I will be next. I have something urgent. I'm just making the next speaker. Thank you.
Okay. There aren't, if you have any comment, if you want to discuss that issue, raise your hand. If not, we're going to take a vote.
Okay. I will say something.
Okay.
Sorry. So two things. First of all, of course, under the so-called apartheid, it is much worse than apartheid with the situation in the West Bank and Gaza. We know that. I wish it was just apartheid. Okay, number one. Number two, even for the Israelis themselves, in Israel, the question is what is democracy, right? Demos, right? So I don't remember any time when the government of Israel decided to go to war that they asked the people what they want. And in fact, I don't remember much asking the people too much, anything. So, there was a war in Lebanon, okay? So there was a movement called Peace Now. One of the leaders was Goni Harnik. So to punish him, they sent him to the Beaufort, and of course he died. And so that was how the democratic government of Israel deals with peace movement. So to me, it is a joke. there is no democracy even among the so-called Jews, Israelis themselves.
So, Shlomo, you are basically saying that the decision to go to war was not made by the Knesset. It was made by the executive branch, which is the government, which is a limited number of people who basically decided to go to war and decided to basically force this war upon the people of Israel and Palestine. Few people without a parliamentary discussion.
Yes, exactly. There is no. By the way, I don't think the United States is a democracy, but that's a different. So definitely Israel is not democracy in any way you look at it. Even for the Jews inside Israel, it is called. There are some democratic elements. There are institutions, and yeah, but overall, no. Thank you.
Do you, Shlomo? Do you think that the idea of religious separation? I mean, including the inclusion of religion into the government, is that consistent in your opinion with democracy, or is that an
no, it's absolutely inconsistent. Should be separation between religion and state. Absolutely. Otherwise, it's one of the things that undermined Israel for years, but that's not the only thing. As Yeshaya Leibovich correctly said many times, he was very disturbed, and he said that eventually this will bring the demise of Israel. Just that alone, not to mention what happened.
Let's go to Nasir. Nasir, what
are your
comments regarding that issue?
There's two things that, when we have the definition of democracy, for example, like America was considered a democracy when it had Africans that were slaves that didn't have the rights of citizens. So when a country, and when I hear from a lot of Israelis that we are a democracy and technically the Palestinians that live in the West Bank and Gaza are not under our jurisdiction, but you can say that, well, slaves were technically not citizens, even though in voting representation they gave the 2/3 rule or something like that. The other thing that makes Israeli democracy complicated is that there's no constitution. And when you asked your question about, for example, does religion have a role in it? And I think that democracy, one thing that you need is you need a constitution that's above the leadership, that's above the parliament and the prime minister, because otherwise what you do is you leave a country like right now what's happening in Israel that's being run at the whim of an elected, irrational group of people who are basically making decisions that are, that are basically being guided by the minority that are able to keep the coalition alive. So when you have a prime minister that's above the constitution, or a small political party that can move that's bigger than the constitution, no constitution, this in a sense it reduces the democracy image of the state. So you have both the denial of rights, not recognizing the people that are under your jurisdiction, as well as no constitution that sits, because in the United States, if you want to go to war, you have to go to Congress, even though this is bypassed all the time in the United States, but it's still there. And we have a thing that, for example, we've had presidents that have been forced out of office because they went against the Constitution. We've had them on trial. We've had them charged with what do they call that when you go to Congress and lie? I forgot.
Declaration of war?
Not declaration, perjury. Thank you, Professor Steinberg. So, it's the concept that the Constitution is above the president, the prime minister, and the parliament.
Okay. So why does a country need a constitution to be a democracy? Why can't you have a democracy without
I'm not saying it is a requirement, but you set yourself in danger because, again, the Constitution is something that says we have a rule of law and we have a sort of a clear guide on what is the rights of citizens, and that the presidents and the leaders are not above that, rather than leaving it open to the whims of people who get elected because of emotional feelings or economic problems or things like that.
Okay. Michael Grossman, you want to contribute to that discussion of whether Israel?
Yes, I wanted to ask a couple questions for historical clarification from Dr. Steinberg that I'm not totally clear on. So first of all, I understand the United States is a representative democracy. It's not a pure democracy. We're electing representatives to represent us. Is that correct?
Yes, that's absolutely correct.
Okay, so, and the other point of clarification was that the original vote around the slaves were that the slaves were counted as 2/3 of a human being. And since they were owned by the white slave owners, they had the voting power of them, but the slaves didn't have voting power. The people who they represent. So my point is just this: to talk about the United States as being called a democracy, I don't think it was necessarily a democracy at the time.
We are speaking about Israel now.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, I don't think Israel's a democracy.
Why? Why not?
I don't think the United States was either. So to use as the excuse, well, Israel's just as good a democracy as America was when they had slaves. That's not a justification. You can't call yourself a democracy if half or more than half of your population has no voting rights. Okay. And my last question is this. I read recently that there has not been since World War II a time when a president in the United States got congressional authority to declare a war. Every war since World War II, the president has said there's a clear and present danger and I have to go to war, and has not gotten approval. Is that true?
I'm not an expert on American.
Well, I'm asking Dr. Steinberg because I know
he's not an expert either.
Not my field. It's not my field either, but I think that's true. Yes, I think that's correct.
All right, let's go to Samir. Samir
Yes.
Square. Do you
Hi, everybody.
Israel is a democracy?
Yes. Hi, everybody. Thank you. Yeah, I agree with you, Joseph, and also with Dr. Steinberg, that Israel is not a democracy. And also I can add that Israel democracy is like 100 years behind the US democracy and 30 years behind South African democracy. And if we talk about Israeli democracy, we can say it's a democracy only for the Jews. And also we can say that the Israeli democracy, it's a work in progress.
But let me ask you a question. So what? Does it harm the people of Israel or the Palestinian that Israel is not a democracy? Is that bad? And
it is that bad.
Why is it bad?
It is bad because that will harm Israel over the long way.
How?
Israel cannot sustain this kind of democracy.
Why wouldn't it be able to sustain?
Why? Because history proves that all over the world, that whether in the US, South Africa, you cannot have a democracy and half of your population have no votes. This is a human rights issue now, and it cannot sustain. It's sustained so far 75 years, but it's not going to continue. We're coming to an end. That's why. The international community does not allow it. Now, all over the world, they are saying they need a free Palestine. So that means Israel cannot continue the way.
Israel doesn't care about what the world wants, and Israel and it said, well, we are the same as the United States, as Russia, as China. We have nuclear power, and we can ignore the whole world because we are a superpower. And
if that's what they think, that now the world pressure, and here the American people's pressure on the US administration to change course. And actually we're seeing it now. President Biden is starting to change policy, that no more weapons to Israel. That is gonna harm them more, and they have to change. Israel eventually, 1 year from now, 2 years from now, they have to find the solution. And I think that the best solution will be one secular democratic state. And that's possible. And
yeah, so the discussion, the title is Israel a democracy? Let's go to Giacomo. Giacomo, do you believe Israel is a democracy?
Yeah, so, well, first one comment is democracy is a very vague term, if you want. Athens was a democracy, and they democratically voted to have Socrates executed. So we can't have only democracy. The issue is how democracy is mediated into a republic and into an institutional arrangement that makes that allows all parts of society to be properly reflected. And Israel, unfortunately, has serious deficits on that level. The governments there seem to remind me of, I was born in Italy, it reminds me of governments in Italy in the 1970s, which you had Byzantine coalitions where one little baby party could bring down the whole government. And there was a perception among the public that this was not a very unfair system, and whether it was democratic or not, it was just unfair and not working in terms of reflecting the will of a majority of people of all aspects of society. And this is what a democracy really is. In the United States at the moment, we have a two-party system, which that is in some ways does not help or fully reflect all positions in society. They're not adequately reflected. So, but I think the issue more in Israel is not whether it's a democratic country. It is the fact that it is completely oppressing land, which it is illegally occupying. So, and that is whether it's democratic. It seems that there's a democratic support for this, because I don't see a real meaningful opposition to this situation in Israel. So if we talk about democracy, people are democratically voting to oppress the Palestinians.
All right. Shlomo, before I go to you, let's go to Jeff, because you spoke already. Jeff Warner, do you think Israel?
I would do it very simple. I would say that a democracy is defined where the people have some role in choosing the government. And with that definition, a yes or no definition, Israel is a democracy. It doesn't have, its definition of people is much smaller than we would like. And how effective the people are in making the government do what they want is different. But the basics of a democracy is that the people have a role in choosing the government, and that is in fact true in Israel.
When you say people, would you include the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza as people?
Well, I do, but they don't yet. But okay, there was a time when
you're the one who is voicing your opinion here, and you say the people choose. And I'm asking you, since you acknowledge that the people in Gaza and the people in the West Bank and East Jerusalem are people. So are you still standing by your perception that Israel is a democracy chosen by the people?
Yeah, it's an imperfect democracy. It's not as good as I would like, or many of us on this call would like. But the basic yes, no, do the people or some fraction of the people have a role in choosing the government? The answer is yes. Okay. But it's an imperfect democracy, as all democracies are imperfect.
All right. Okay. Shlomo?
Okay, quickly, just one more comment. Because in Israel, every child that is born to be a soldier at the age of 18. Until the age of 18, of course, it's not democracy in the family and then in school, okay? So 18, he goes to the army for 3 years without pay, in my case at least, and then you belong to the army, because every year they take you for a month or so, and every war they of course take you. It is a militaristic country that cannot be real democratic. So yeah, you're right. Jeff, I think, said that there are levels of democracy and so on, and I agree. But Israel is on the lower end of this spectrum of democracies. Number one. Number two, I have a quick question to Dr.
Steinberg.
Yeah. If you could just give us some overview of the idea of the scene relationships. And I understand, I imagine that it has to do with a two-state solution, but in any case, it would be, I am very interested in it. So if you can talk about it, I would appreciate it.
What's the question?
About the thin relationships that he mentioned, the book by Avishai Margalit.
Oh, okay.
It's the book in which he talks about it is called The Ethics of Memory. And what he says is that thick relationships are deep relationships. In other words, family relationships. He mentions national relationships. He calls them relationships with countrymen. And that thin relations are the relations with strangers and people with whom there isn't an obvious bond. So an older way of talking about that distinction is the one between community and society. But where communities are important emotional bonds and societies are legalistic and formal relationships. And I think he wants to avoid the feeling that this social relationship is only a formal one. But he does talk about certain relationships with strangers where basically just being a human being is enough to require a certain kind of respect and relationships. So I find it very appealing as a way of not only talking about a democratic possibility among people who are defined more in terms of differences than anything else, but also as a way of establishing a certain kind of emotional interest in that kind of relationship, so that there can be a kind of emotional reward, a kind of pleasure in negotiating with a stranger and dealing with a stranger, even if one has nothing in common with that stranger.
So how it is related to the Israeli-Palestinian state?
Well, my guess is that he's thinking profoundly about that, even though he doesn't reduce his example to that. In other words, he's a philosopher and not directly a political commentator. But I think the question of being able to have a relationship with somebody who is defined as being fundamentally different is the most important principle of democracy. So another term for that is pluralism or plurality. That democracy has to do with the collaboration of people who are fundamentally different if you ask them to describe themselves, difference in religion and in personal background and family and in sexual taste, almost anything you like, but still have the capacity and also the interest to live in the same world. So pluralism and plurality, I think, to me, are the most important components of democratic life, along with freedom and equality.
All right, let's go to Steve and then Charles, and then we'll take a vote.
Hello, all. I agree completely with Jeff about his definition of democracy, but I wanted to do an aside. I think the solution for the problems with Palestine and Israel is to move the remaining Palestinians in Gaza to the West Bank, and Jordan can then annex the West Bank as part of Jordan and give Gaza, ruined as it is, to Israel. And I think that's a very, very decent solution to this problem of this war that's continuing to go on, because it seems like there are things that people cannot reach a reconciliation about.
What do you think about that, Professor Steinberg? Moving the Palestinians from Gaza into the West Bank and connecting them to Jordan.
Annexing the West Bank to Jordan.
Yeah.
It's hard to be polite in this kind of context. I think another word for that is deportation. So I don't.
I mean, and it's wrong on so many levels. First of all, like, especially since the West Bank is really regarded by some Jews as more holy than what Gaza is. There's actually no historical claims to Gaza. I mean, displacing 2 million people and asking them to move and be displaced, I mean, no comment. As a Palestinian, I have no comment.
But why is it that the solutions that are always being proposed require segregation between Jews and Palestinians by people who live in an integrated secular society?
I think it's the opposite. I actually see that there's more support for one state solution outside of Israel and Palestine than there is inside. And I'll tell you why. I mean, I see it as. We officially have our first team of the day. Moving on to the elite. I'm sorry, someone is playing. Okay, yeah. Because here's the thing, Joseph, and I really do admire the people who support democracy, because we know that that's the just solution. Everybody's equal. But on the other hand, and I've used the analogy before, that can we say that like someone who comes out of a car accident, is he going to go back jogging? That there has to kind of be a separation. And then eventually, like the European Union that started economically and then politically, and then you have a single currency, but that took 50 years. But you're saying that Israelis and Palestinians overnight are going to become one state and become a binational state? I mean, I'm on the ground half the year. It's not going to happen.
All right, Charles, do you think Israel is a democracy?
Obviously not. The debate around that is interesting. You know, it goes to one state solution or two state solution, and you know, it could have democracy as a one state solution, or we could have democracy in two states. But Nathan Thrall on May 9th on Democracy Now! Drew the point that people think that these are Israel's two options. And by putting either of those two options forward, they're ignoring that Israel has a third option, which they are continuing with regardless, which is not to create one state, not to create two states, not to have democracy in either, but to continue annexing Palestinian land and to separate Palestinians into smaller and smaller walled off cantons so that they can do so. And I think, you know, so what I see in terms of our approach is, you know, to thread that needle and basically recognize the fact that this is what's happening. And by putting forward those other two ideas, you're not necessarily dealing with the existing reality. But I really agree with Professor Steinberg that this gets to the people, a people being able to recognize a plurality to their existence that is greater than their ethnic, religious, you know, all these different ways that we think of identifying ourselves. And until that happens, I don't see there's going to be a solution created. So,
all right, let's take a vote on this issue. Is Israel a democracy? Do you believe Israel is a democracy? Please vote. We had 32% voted yes, 68 voted no when we started.
I can't raise my hand, but I'd like to make a comment.
Okay.
I can't figure out how to raise my hand in this Zoom thing. But
yeah,
I'd like to mention
let's finish the vote, and then we'll let you make your comment.
I think you finished the vote. It was 1/3 yes and 2/3 no.
No, that was the beginning. Now we're taking a subsequent vote after the discussion. Can you publish the vote? So now it's 17% yes, 83% no. We started with 32 yes and 68 no. Now it's 17 yes, 17% yes, and 83% no.
I think democracy is something that's never been attained. And you're talking about the West Bank being annexed by Jordan. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's still part of Jordan. It's simply occupied by the Israelis. And you're not going to uproot, a couple million people from their ancestral homeland in Gaza, where they've been for 3,000 years, and move them to the West Bank. And the West Bank still is part of Transjordan. It's the Jordanians never ceded the land. It's just the Israelis occupy it.
Yeah.
Am I wrong on this, anybody?
I think
Yes,
Jordan.
Yes, I'll tell you why. Because King Hussein, before he died, actually relinquished control of the West Bank to the Palestinians.
How did he do
to
that?
The PLO.
How did he do that?
Because
it's royal lands, and he just gave it to him.
No, it was a decree because when the PLO when the West Bank was annexed by Jordan, there was no Palestinian government or anything. But it was one thing. I can't remember the exact year, but I believe it was. It might have been 88, 89, 1988 or 1989 is when he formally relinquished control over the West Bank.
Okay, let's have Charles, Sean. Sean, you wanted to say something about that issue? Sean Zar.
Joseph, what you mentioned that if Israel's a democracy or not, but my concern is that Israel claims to be a Jewish state. How could you blend Jewish state with democracy?
I agree with you. It's an oxymoron.
It's oxymoron. Yes, I don't understand that. Yeah, that's my question. Thanks.
Okay, so let's go to. We took a vote on that, so let's go to the. If we can talk about.
Mr. Fumihiko Mori was trying to make a comment.
Okay, but if we can talk about the IPC, is it perfect? What's the alternative? Is it a good way to make peace? And talk about the assumptions. What is it about these assumptions that cannot be reached if we have major funding? If we can go back to that discussion, I would appreciate that very much. And let me stop sharing and ask you, what do you think about those assumptions? Are they realistic? Would they bring peace? Does anyone want to offer an opinion? So I see Shlomo say, yes, indeed. Anybody else wants to state an opinion regarding whether those assumptions are, well, if you think that those assumptions are unrealistic, that they cannot be reached, I would be actually more interested in listening to you. Why do you think, if you do, those assumptions are unrealistic? What is it about them that is unrealistic? And if they are realistic, why would they not make peace? That's the goal, is peace. Okay, so I see no hands, so I'll just go to the concluding remarks, and that is I believe that a common democratic.
I'm sorry, Joseph, can I ask you a question?
Can bring peace. It's the only way to bring peace, in my opinion. Online election is feasible. The assumptions are feasible. They can become a reality. I want to remind you that 1 week of war between Gaza and Israel cost over $3 billion, probably a lot more now when the war is so intense. There is no current legitimate government in Israel, Palestine, because there is no current government that is elected by the people of Israel and Palestine. But a federal government will be a legitimate government. And if we are able to obtain the funding to create the election, Professor Steinberg said that could be 10, 20 years. I think that it could be done within 1 year, because it's mostly a technical issue to create this election and to create this government. This is what $100 million cost. You can buy a Van Gogh, you can buy a Airbus, you can buy a Los Angeles mansion, or in my opinion, you can make peace in Israel, Palestine. It's really a drop in the bucket, and it can make peace. And the goal is peace. There is no other goal. So I want to thank Professor Steinberg for your generosity and for your agreement to participate in this exercise, and for your time and the time that you took to prepare for this and meeting with me and answering the questions for all of us. If you want to make final comments, I will let you do that right now, but otherwise we will close the meeting. Professor Steinberg, do you want to?
Thank you very much for asking me, and I think it's been an excellent conversation. I'm very happy to be part of it. I do think that this is a wonderful plan. I think the time it would take to gain legitimacy and support is not a technical issue. I think it's a political issue, and will take an enormous amount of work, but I fully support it.
All right. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for participating, and hopefully you'll come to our next simulation. Thank you all. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.